Hey Adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Cimpatico Studios where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on Cimpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. So go ahead, reach out. Hey Adapters, welcome to the show. Today our guest is Kavita Naidu. Kavita works as an international human rights lawyer working in climate justice at the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development based in Thailand. She works with grassroots women in Asia and the Pacific to build a feminist climate justice movement. Kavita will share how the Feminist Participatory Action Research, or FPAR, can create system of change through the mobilization of grassroots women and political activism. Hi Kavita, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be on the show.
Well, I'm excited about this conversation. And first off, I want to check in. I know you're in Sydney, Australia, but what's going on in regards to the pandemic, COVID-19? How's that impacting what you're doing?
Well, I think it's been a very difficult challenge, mostly with the grassroots women that I work with, because as they're at the brunt of facing the climate crisis, so they are at the brunt of facing the pandemic, because a number of these women are daily wage earners. They've lost access to their livelihoods. They were already suffering from high levels of poverty, and now that's only deepened, and it's become quite worse. We've found through talking with our memberships and networks that the rate of violence against women have increased, particularly now that they're forced to just remain at home. And so these are some of the challenges that we're finding that the pandemic has caused. In addition to what they were already suffering from the climate. And that's just one of the programs that, that the office that I work for looks at, which is the Climate Justice Program. But, we work across a range of other programs. So we work across labor and migration, grounding the global, women in power and so forth. And so for each one of us, they're very unique, but also common challenges that we find that the women of the global South, particularly in our region, Asia and the Pacific, are facing right now because of the pandemic.
So is that the forum is the actual organization that you're working for, and that's based in Thailand? I mean, what is the spectrum of issues? Is it mainly focused on women's issues, or what's the whole scope there?
Okay, so yes, our office is based in Thailand, and we're a feminist membership organization. So we work with over 248 feminist organizations and individual activists in the Asia and Pacific region, and we work across 27 countries. And really, the premise of the work that we do is advancing women's human rights and development justice. And so when I say development justice, it's sort of like the framework that we work in. And what that does is that we interrogate the systems of oppression, which we call is the nexus between patriarchy, militarism, fundamentalism, and neoliberalism. So for us, it's all about demanding structural change, because our social, political, economic structures are what's oppressing the women in this region. And so the whole thing about advancing development justice really is to ensure that the human rights of these women are being upheld.
Okay, let's, I guess, talk about one of these tools and approaches. And I mentioned it, FPAR. What is that exactly? I mean, you sort of alluded to it, but what is that?
Sure. So this is what we call a tool for political activism, and most of our work is actually grounded in this research. So the participatory action research has existed for a long time, but what we do, we call it the feminist participatory action research. So really, it's for the women, owned by the women, and carried through by the women. Um, and what it is really, it's the women we build the capacity of women to understand the gendered issues of climate crisis. And once they're able to understand how the climate is impacting their human rights, we find that they become empowered, informed, and then engage in collective advocacy to demand climate justice. So would you like me to share how we do this FPAR?
Well, sure. Before we, I guess, dig into it too, maybe a little bit more context. And so you have the word research into it, but it sounds like obviously there's on the ground applications of what's happening there, right?
Yeah. So it's research that's not just, so we work under a framework, so we call it the theory of change. So it's not only building the capacity, but also providing them with the skills and tools they need to build advocacy and movement architecture. And they do this through sort of creating and developing their own knowledge, resources, and tools. And so, really, our role is to just support the empowerment of these women through what is really an educational and research. We don't call it a project or a program because because the women are not the subjects of the research. They're actually the subjects of the inquiry that sets the agenda for identifying what are the problems in your communities, what do you think needs to be done to address those problems, and how are you going to do it. So it's not something that we sort of impose. It's just we provide them with the tools, and it's really, really about the women themselves collectively understanding and mobilizing to effect change.
Okay, in some of these countries, I'm sure long-standing issues with women's rights and such, but climate change. This is, I mean, relatively new in this conversation. How does that fit into it? And I guess how did you kind of your organizations bring that as an issue that they can focus on and recognize that these are new problems that they have to deal with? Like what are the like? How's it affecting food security and all those kind of things?
Sure. So our organization is over 33 years old. And so originally there was a program which was called Breaking Women Out of Marginalization. And what we understood at that time when we were working with these issues with women is that these issues of, land grabbing or forced displacement because of the development of a major hydro dam or mines, polluting and causing environmental problems in these communities. And so at that stage, what we decided was that we'd have sort of like a set program called Women in the Environment. And for a number of time, we were simply just looking at environmental issues and, of course, how that then violates human rights. But then as I suppose the discourse and the understanding evolved, particularly, since Kyoto, and then this whole understanding of that there's this large player called climate that's also responsible for, so it's kind of like added to the environmental problems that these women were already facing. But with the climate crisis, it's an existential threat, which means the very existence of, humanity is on the balance. And so then the program developed to become a program called Climate Justice, which means that we really need to demand a structural change that stops the continued climate injustices that are happening in the region. And so we still look at women sort of environment justice issues, but we are now fully engaged with what the climate crisis, because this is the reality when it comes to climate crisis in the region. This is a region that is completely ravaged by superstorms, typhoons, floods, droughts, unseasonal heavy rainfalls, and just the impact of all of that. It's utter devastation. there is loss and damage. It's really like some of these parts are not even, I mean, the question of adaptation doesn't even arise because the land has been completely, destroyed by salination. There's rising sea levels. People are being displaced or forcibly relocated. In terms of food insecurity, yes, the most common trend across the entire region is the increasing temperatures. And what it's really, really doing is affecting crop yields, crop failure, agricultural production. It's causing health issues for women because the large majority of women in this region are actually agricultural workers. They're the fisher folks. And even when you look at, the role of women, the domestic and unpaid care work that they do. Women are usually responsible for whether it's collecting firewood or collecting water. And even for instance, if I use the example of collecting water, previously it used to just take perhaps an hour to get to a water source. Now these women travel far longer because there is vast water shortage in the region. So there's a myriad of really of problems which are causing human rights violations for the women because it's already happening in a system that was already rather oppressed in this region. These women have very little rights in terms of access to an education, access to financial assets or land or resources or information or even, in political spaces. And then, you throw in the whatever they were already doing as part of their livelihoods is now being worsened through climate crisis. So that's really the challenge.
Well, I imagine too that especially the women on the ground in developing countries, that they have all these existing issues. And as your organization, that must be tricky that, okay, now we've got climate change. And even if you're in the developed world, people on the ground aren't even necessarily thinking about climate change. Is this sort of a information that you're bringing them? Because I imagine they're not saying, well, now climate change. It's like, well, no, your existing problems are only going to get worse. It must be a kind of a fine line to sort of say, well, maybe as you're dealing with climate change, there's an opportunity to address these existing problems. I mean, I guess that's sort of the approach because, it's just one more thing
it's huge
to deal with.
Yeah, it's huge. It's complex. I think it's deliberately convoluted so that many of us, I mean, those of us who are privileged and in developing countries also don't really understand how climate change is impacting our rights. So yes, you're right. The challenge is that we work with grassroots women. And the reason we do this is we really believe in autonomous feminist movements being able to demand the structural change. And we've seen the impacts of this sort of mobilization, which I'll share later on. But in terms of how do we actually break down this work to get these women empowered to start working on this research, we really start from the ground. So usually there's a theme. And so for the research that was completed very recently, the theme was on climate displacement and loss and damages. And so what we do is, we ask for expressions of interest, applications are received, and they're mainly by grassroots organizations that are working on either climate, environment, or women's rights issues within these communities in the countries already. And so once we select those organizations, because key for us is that they need to be working with grassroots communities. So the most marginalized women, ethnic women, indigenous women, rural and remote women. And so what we do is the way it's structured is there is a mentor and the mentor is usually from the organization who sort of leads the research, and she works with a young women researcher, and the young women researcher is usually from the community or who can access the community. And what we do is we bring these mentors and young women researchers, including their translators, to trainings that we conduct at APWLD. And that's it's quite an intense week-long training. And the thing is, the methods that we use to train is not a PowerPoint presentation. It is not a lecture style training, because these are grassroots women who, for one, have probably never caught flights in their life. or travel to another country.
Mm.
A lot of them can't speak English. They don't have a formal education necessarily. And so this is what I think makes FPAR quite unique, is that all our training is very interactive. We use storytelling, we use sketches and drawings, we have role plays, we make it quite fun. We have games. So even to explain how human rights works, we actually use a game so that the women understand. We actually have to draw a village and to show what is the impact of a burning sun with the with their crops, or why are they always dehydrated, or and all the rest of it. So we have to do it in such a manner that actually completely unpacks the climate crisis. And I actually sit down with these women and I draw the world, and I put in the oil rigs and the hydro dams and the agribusiness, and then I show that all of these industries use fossil fuels to operate, and what it does, it heats up the planet, and that causes all these natural disasters and so forth, and then really break it down to what it means every day for these women who are facing this in their lives, but didn't know. Because, I mean, for most of the time, they just think it's an act of God, or this is how it was going to be in any case, and it's just another hardship that we deal with. But the minute these women understand these connections and these links, and they understand that there is a way to actually challenge these systems to demand climate justice, the historical responsibility of the global north, we even unpack very technical concepts such as neoliberalism and capitalism, I mean, to a grassroots community. And we begin by, identifying, the power relations that they have within their own homes. These women, I mean, forget about, trying to challenge at the national level or regional or international. Their oppression starts literally at their homes. And many of them don't even identify these patriarchal structures. And so a week-long training, break it down in bits by bits, and we do this over 24 months. So over 24 months, there's 3 separate sets of training. And in between those trainings, these women return to their communities, where they find the means of sharing this information and knowledge and building the capacity of the communities that they work with in their own languages and so forth.
Well, this might be a different episode we do with you, but I just imagine these workshops itself, how honest, is there icebreakers and well, this is my situation. And it's just, what they're dealing with in their homes. Well, my husband's not going to like that. And so the dynamics of what you're actually teaching them, do you get that feedback in person, sort of saying, I like what you're saying, but there's no way that these sort of changes and these expectations are going to happen in my culture, in my home?
Yeah, absolutely. We face this all the time, and literally we start by what we call the Mandala Drawing, and it's literally a paper plate with a couple of colored pens, and we ask them to draw. When was to draw their family lives, their their shared experiences of what they do, and one of the key things we ask them to do is, when was the first time you realized that you were different to your brother or your father? And that's how they first start thinking. So why did my brother go to school and why didn't I go to school? Or how come my brother or my dad gets to eat but we don't? And so it's really getting these women to think for themselves about what sort of patriarchal culture that they exist in that has actually oppressed them to do anything more. And you're right, it takes, for some of them, it takes a couple of days for them to actually fit in these different concepts, to then understand, I deserve better. I am gonna challenge and and speak up. And this is what FPI is really all about. It's about how to amplify their voices. And you're right, there is a lot of challenges. I mean, in the region that we work with, personal security safety is a huge issue, which is why it's really interesting. I'll give you an example. In Pakistan, you can imagine, in Pakistan, the women, we asked them the same question, how did you do it? I mean, you're not even allowed to step into the balcony of your households for most women. I mean, obviously the young women research and the mentor, we're able to, this is how we got to work with them. How does it even work? And this is what the women said. They're like, we realized through this FPAR is that, and they showed their fist, right? And they said, you can't have this if you just have one person. What we do is we collectively inform other women, and once they understand, so this is all about collectivism, the power of mobilization to do this, and they have.
Well, listen, I was going to ask you about Pakistan. I'm glad you used that example. But again, to me, and if you're bringing women from different countries, I'm assuming that happens. Yeah. You guys must have to make tough decisions. Like, well, culturally, okay, in Pakistan, it's much harder. Where maybe in Cambodia, the women have different rights and different problems. And is there some sort of universal standard of treatment that you sort of have to? I guess we're getting into the details. I just imagine these workshops are very fascinating, and also the women that actually attend these things, even though they might have their own stories, the fact that they were allowed to attend in whatever sense,
That's right.
That they're, whoever gave them permission, in some ways they probably represent, maybe they're better off than actually a lot of women back in their home communities.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Particularly because some of these organizations are quite large. So there are already a lot of movements that already exist in these countries and, in these communities. And so they do have the resources and the knowledge. Like I said earlier, there are feminist movements that already exist. There are youth movements, there are indigenous movements, there's LGBTQI movements that already exist. And so the whole idea really is to go to those women, if they have access to those women that are the most marginalized in the rural communities. And we don't do that ourselves, really. We only provide the support for the women from that community to actually learn the skills, have the knowledge, the grit and the empowerment to go and do this. And you're right, it's absolutely different in every country and regional context. How it works in the Pacific is completely different to how it works in Central Asia. The challenges of Indonesia and Philippines don't compare to the challenges of Thailand and Nepal. Very different, very unique country context. But and this is the thing, I think the common challenge is that they do understand the oppressive neoliberal economic development model, as well as the patriarchy that stifles them to really claim and uphold their rights. That's a common challenge. They understand. In terms of the impacts from climate changes, this is also quite common across the board. Most of them are farmers. Most of them are facing water shortage, food insecurity, health problems. Most of them agree that they have no say in their houses or in political spaces. And so this is how they collectively come up with what can they do to challenge this and to demand for what they need to improve their lives. And we give them the tools. We have tools like power mapping and critical pathways, which are things where we draw like an axis, and we just say, where will you get the most support? Where do you find the least support? Where so and then they map themselves. Are there other women NGOs? Are there other movements? Are there trade unions that can help us? Are there other Indigenous women in our communities or in neighboring communities that would want to mobilize and do this? And so what we find is, we bring a set of mentor and young woman researcher. They go back and they do this with 5 villages or 12 villages. And that's how this whole collective empowerment starts fitting in.
Well, gosh, we've covered so much ground, and we just blew through this. And I've got so many more questions, but I know we've got to kind of wrap this up now. But I do have a question from the chat, and if you sort of, I guess, quickly, you talked about, and this from Sarah, I'd love to hear how you teach such complicated concepts as neoliberalism or capitalism with games, storytelling, etc. How do you do that in a game?
Yeah. It took years and years of practice and training, and we're still trying to improve this, actually. I mean, I only started working at this organization last May. And my topic really was for them to understand climate change and human rights. Where did climate change even come from? And so one of the things we did is I worked with other trainers as well, and we came up with a climate oppression timeline where we literally had to go all the way back into like the colonial whaling and sandalwood trading days for them to understand this whole thing about colonialism and how, you know, environmental plunder had actually started even before our lifetimes. And then to bring in the Industrial Revolution, the wars, the Green Revolution, um, the Cold War, all the way into the last 30 years of hyper economic development, for them to actually go, right, this has been happening for a very long time. This is why we are in the positions where we are. We're in a vicious cycle of poverty, and we don't have equal rights to education. We don't have access to, you know, healthcare, or we don't have a basic income. So all of these complex and you know, hands down, it is challenging, but it is very rewarding, because anybody in any position is able to understand um, knowledge. As long as you make it in a form that's digestible and accessible, it works. Yeah, it really works. You know, and we've done this. I think we've done over 50 FPARs in the last 8 years in over 20 countries. So we know that this really, really works to build feminist movements at the grassroots level.
Okay, so we have scratched the surface, and I think we've talked about, you know, doing future episodes, and I think even just really maybe focusing on a single workshop. I have a million more questions around that. I think people could learn a lot from. But we're going to transition into just chatting. We're going to wrap up this episode,
Sure.
so just stick around. But this has been fantastic, and when we get into just chatting, I want to maybe get your ideas on maybe some future topics to talk about. But this has been great. Thanks for coming on, and hold on. But yeah,
Great. Thanks, Doug.
thank you.